I want to kitbash this Outrider into a crazy Black Templar, but first I need to figure out how am I going to transform him from a pretty basic looking Ultramarine into a crazy faith-driven Zealot on a bike. And first, I need to grab some basic parts. I grabbed some interesting Primaris parts, however, I remember there was one faction that's even more faithful to the Emperor than even the Black Templars. And so, I reached into the Sisters of Battle kit, where I found this incredible icon piece that I think will be able to tell a unique story. And so, let's kitbash a Black Templar. I started off by giving him this really cool sword from the Sword Brethren kit. To secure my icon, I decided to drill a hole to make sure I'll be able to put it in there and not have to worry about it. It was quite fortunate that my drill bit was almost the exact perfect size as the icon's handle. Also, if you're noticing some weird paint on the model, it's actually because this was a very old model that I had. I bought a used, so I had to strip the paint off. The icon was a bit more wobbly than I wanted it to be, so I decided to use some Tamiya cement and actually glue it to the backpack. Then I took out some sprue glue and decided to secure the little hole just to reduce the wobble even further. I considered adding this really cool shield to the side of the model, but it felt a little bit mismatched, so instead I opted into this really cool book, further reinforcing the really crazy religious aspect of the Black Templars. The book was designed to hang, so I had to scrape off a little bit of the underside of it just to make sure it would glue on a bit firmer. Afterwards, I wanted to give this guy a really cool hood ornament, which I considered using this chalice, however, it was blocking the guns. So I opted in to use a skull instead, as we know Black Templars are very big fans of skulls. However, the model was visually a little bit too back heavy, so instead I opted in for this much bigger skull that will create a much more interesting hood ornament. And the model looks absolutely incredible, however the base is extremely boring, so I'm gonna fix that. But first, I need this box to find the ancient wisdom within it. And it says to, subscribe. Well, you can't argue with ancient wisdom. And now for the base. I decided to use these old Imperium ruins that I think will work really well and just fit thematically. I went for this really big ruin, but I quickly realized that going for the smaller one actually worked much better, as the bigger one overshadowed the model entirely. I also found this extremely interesting bit that I thought would make a really dynamic pose for this bike, as if he's about to jump into the air. When I began securing the ruined wall, I realized it's not gonna hold on its own, so I decided to pull out some sprue glue and make sure that it's gonna stay there for sure. And since I already had sprue glue out, I decided to use it in all of the other bits just to make sure everything was gonna be there. Also adding this additional piece of debris just to create more thematic look. Since the model and the base were disconnected, I decided to paint it first just to get it out of the way, using a dark umber color and then dry brushing some light umber afterwards. I then took some of this old rust and applied it with some water to the ruined, where I imagined there would be rust collecting. Afterwards, dry brushing on some metal just to make it look a bit more interesting. Then using some asphalt texture paste and applying some dust on top of it. And as always, you gotta add some cool looking tufts, because tufts are awesome. For the armor, I wanted something that looked awesome and at the same time created excellent contrast with the base. So I started off by applying some German gray, afterwards adding a tiny bit of white to start creating these cold highlights in the model. I tried to go quite slowly in my highlights to make sure that I didn't just jump the gun right away. After I applied some highlights with an airbrush, I decided to add these manual hot points where essentially the light is getting reflected off the armor. However, with what I had in mind, the model was not unfortunately bright enough, so I ended up going a little bit higher in the highlights and making sure that there was very good dynamic contrast between them. And then creating these hot points on the armor where the light is getting most reflected. I personally found that this is a very cool way to avoid very complex edge highlighting and instead focus on some of these points where the light is getting reflected and create the idea that the armor is actually far more complicated than it actually is. And now that I'm nearly done, it's time to move on to the red. I'll be honest, this guy basically got a free promotion because I don't want to paint white shoulder pads, so he's instantly a veteran. A lot of my Black Templars are veterans for this exact same reason, because frankly, just white is not a fun color to paint, and if I can avoid it, I'd rather do it. And let's be honest, I'm pretty sure whoever came up with the idea that veterans avoid having white on their shoulder pads knew exactly what they were doing. For my red, I essentially just took some AK deep red, added some black to it, and then worked my way back to the deep red. I then used a little bit of British khaki to apply it to the icon piece, as well as started working on the skull. The thought to use just some contrast paint and get it over with did cross my mind. However, I wanted to go for something much more personal and interesting, so I ended up creating my own bone color instead. Using some British khaki with a bit of black, and then just working my way up to white. For the very cool book on his bike, I just ended up using a bit of mahogany as I felt like it was a cool color. For all of the metallics, I just ended up using some gunmetal gray that is frankly my go-to color when it comes to metals. As you might have noticed, the model looks extremely bright, and frankly, that's part of the process. I'm actually gonna use a wash to dull down the whole miniature, but at the same time, create a smoother transition between all the colors I've built up, rather than this extremely bright armor. When I began applying the wash, I entirely forgot that this was the brush that I used to apply the ground texture. What I haven't realized that I didn't wash it entirely too well, so I actually ended up depositing tiny speckles of ground dust onto the vehicle and all of the armor. Luckily, it wasn't too visible, so I think I got away with it. If you want to recreate your own wash, I use speed painted gray and black with some flow improver from Liquitex. After the wash was a bit more dry, I began reapplying some of the highlights, mainly to the red, as I really wanted these shoulder pads to just pop off the model. I think the combination of black and red looks incredibly cool, especially when your black is slightly bluish tinted like this. So I wanted to make sure my red was as pure and as bright as possible. In fact, I enjoy red so much, I ended up painting the purity seals as red as well, as I've seen it done in Black Templars previously. For the icon, I wanted to create this effect of Emperor's radiance just shining through it. The fate of this Black Templar is so powerful that it's empowering the Relic, and together, they're exerting this radiance. This is where things went wrong. I expected this to be a very quick and basic OSL that'll just make this icon look incredible and have this really cool glow effect. But it just looks kind of green and a bit weird, and frankly, a bit lazy. So I'm gonna spend the next probably half an hour actually just working on this icon and make it come alive. At this moment, I felt a bit defeated, as I expected this to be the prettiest part of the model, and my expectations were frankly demolished. I didn't quite know what I wanted to do with it to try and fix it, so I ended up just creating some of these very yellow colors and trying to destroy some of the green that ended up appearing on the icon. During this process, I ended up accidentally creating these lines that actually had this really cool effect, as if the light is so powerful that this radiance is just bursting out of the icon. So I ended up focusing on that and then grabbing some Imperial Fist contrast paint again and then going over to give it this very nice saturated look. They give it a very rich and vibrant color. Then just going back in with a little bit of white just to create some of the hot spots, and the icon frankly looked absolutely incredible and exactly what I originally envisioned it to be. I then attempted to apply some OSL to the backpack and that didn't go so well, but luckily that wasn't a big visible thing, so let's ignore that and move on. For the skin tone, I did the typical quick thing where I just used some Bugman Glow with a bit of umber and then mixed it up and then went my way to the white highlights. The only big difference that I tried with this model was I tended to accentuate some of the face wrinkles that I wanted this guy to have, as I envisioned him to be much older than some of the other Black Templars. I also used some of my highlight to create these textures on his skin where I'm imagining there's just a very large amount of tiny scars that haven't fully healed in a proper manner. Then of course I got to the most awesome part, which is painting the gold. Luckily this was the easiest part, as the gold paint I use is just such a magical paint, it goes on smoothly, there's never any issues. It was a nice refreshing take. I also used a bit of red just to create some OSL in the helmet. For the sword, I want to create this effect that there's just lightning coming out of it and going throughout the blade, that he's energizing this blade and just getting ready for this massive powerful attack. To start that off, I just grabbed some dark sea blue, applying it to the blade as I didn't want any pure black on the blade itself. Then grabbing a bit more blue and then mixing it into the paint, creating this very centered line that would essentially accentuate where the power is being concentrated. Doing a few layers until I had somewhat of a vibrant color, but still dark enough where it wouldn't be overpowering the lightning. Then adding a bit of white to my color and creating these random jiggity lines that I wanted to essentially create the idea of lightning. Then I added a tiny bit of turquoise, as I felt it would create much more interesting and vibrant lightning colors, trying to create thinner and thinner lines as if the lightning is just very crisp and sharp. And with that, the only thing left to do was attach the model to the base and apply some dust to the wheels to connect the model and the base together. And now for the final result. Thank you for sticking around and watching through the whole video. I'll see you next year. Goodbye.